recently I've learned a lot of information about what's going on with the catalogs at Scott. So you're going to hear about that further on. And one of the people who gets my stamp update pages has now become the editor of the Scott Classic Specialized Catalogue. So I sent him this presentation and an article that I never finished on the same topic that has much more information in it. So you will hear a little bit about what's going to happen with the catalog in the next couple of issues. Okay, so as you know, I've prepared update pages for the Scott Brown International albums, and I've been through the Scott Specialized Catalog twice, number by number, every single country. So I know a lot about what's going on in there, and I found a lot of things that I objected to, and this is sort of my collection of the things that are nastiest going on. I have been submitting problems to Scott for many years, usually on finding that they had the wrong illustration for a stamp, or the number, two numbers of the same thing, and so on and so on. And most of these they've fixed, but what I'm discussing here will be things that I think are more serious issues with the catalog. Obviously, they don't want to change too much in the catalog because everybody out there in the United States uses Scott numbers, and all the dealers have everything arranged by Scott numbers and countries and so on. So it's a big thing to do anything major in terms of changes. So mostly what I'm suggesting isn't terribly complicated, but there are going to be some changes if any of them are accepted. And obviously, if they change stuff in the Scott Classic Specialized, they have to propagate these changes to the full thing and to the U.S. Specialized. Okay, one of the problems with the Classic, it's very large. That last exposition, but one, had 1,382 pages. And the very interesting thing about it is, although it's a hardcover book, it's not produced the way normal hardcover books are, which is to have signatures and have the thing stitched to a cloth backing. Fortunately, it's what they call a perfect binding. It's just glued along the edges, cut edges of the paper. So even though it's hardcover, which I suppose helps somewhat its durability, almost every one of the issues I've had that I've worked heavily with, it eventually broke somewhere in the middle.
Although, Phil, it is a lot better than the regular catalogs in that those are since they split them into 2 volumes per volume, they don't even stand up.
Yeah, they don't stand up. That's true.
And it's very, very irritating.
One of the issues I have with what's contained in Scott's Classic Specialized, that they've catered to the people who collect Great Britain through George VI. And so they included the entire stamps for the British Commonwealth up to 1952 when George VI died. There's a lot of stamps there, and there are also strange issues that even some non-British Commonwealth countries who have sets that run past 1940, they don't take the 1940 stamps out. So they would save a certain amount of space if they got rid of these, but I don't think it would be tremendously useful in terms of reducing the size of the catalog. So the question is, are we going to split the catalog? The way they would normally do this, given Scott's previous behavior, is they would split it by name of the country. And I looked and I found out where the exact middle of the catalog was. If they split it there, it would be between India Orcha and India Poonch, which is not really a major place to split it, but anyway. And hopefully, again, they've been adding types, new types. For example, Morocco local issues and so on. They've been adding types until last year fairly frequently, but I don't think that would change the balance between the two halves materially. Now, I also thought about having the thing split up by time. And this would allow, as the Specialized itself does, collectors interested in earlier issues or perhaps later issues to get only one of the 2 volumes. As we've seen from the now 12-volume catalog, they don't tell you half of one of those volumes. They didn't make it a 12 volume. One place you could have it a true 19th century catalog, which, by the way, would end on 31st December 1900. not 1899, I should think. The outbreak of World War One is one of the places I might want to have the catalog broken, because it's really the end of the classic period, because you have all sorts of chaos both in First and Second World War, during the war, and then after the war, which makes it all rather messy. And if you ended at the end of World War II, yeah, that would make the catalog even bigger than it already is. So that's a problem. But if you look on the Scott internet page, you will see that they are going to split the Classic Specialized Catalog into two. And they're splitting it in Iceland and then India starting the second volume. And they will. I've also recently heard that they're still going to be hardcover. Again, the new editor is a guy named Thomas Lawley, who was one of the recipients of my update pages. So I've heard a few things about what's going on with that. Now, number changes. I feel that they've treated souvenir sheets inconsistently in the catalog. A lot of souvenir sheets have their own number. A lot of souvenir sheets are a variant number under the last stamp in a set. So I'm suggesting that they should change that lowercase minor variant number to an uppercase interpolation suffix and treat all of the souvenir sheets as real items rather than as variants. There are a lot of sets that start in period before 1940. The main perpetrators here are the King George VI pictorial sets, of which there are several dozen. And what they've done, and I don't know when this happened, I haven't researched old issues of the catalog, but there was a set issued typically in 1938 with a certain perforation. Later on, they reissued most of the set in different perforation. And these are more common. And I don't know whether it's because they're more common and therefore cheaper, but in any case, Scott has given the major numbers for these sets to the later issue. So if you're doing what I was doing, that is making a catalog that runs to 1940, you don't want to see the stamps you have on your album pages be the minor varieties, even though they were issued first. There's also an issue with these that they treat different perforations of stamps very differently. In many cases, when the whole set or most of a set exists in several perforations, they list the perforations as individual sets. In other cases, even though there are a lot of perforations varieties, they list the varieties under their particular number of which they are varieties. So that should be examined. I'm sure some things could be clarified by doing that. If you're also familiar with British Commonwealth, you know that there are die varieties of several issues. And again, those really should be separated out so that they're listed separately from one another. I started complaining about the minor numbers given to the Borneo Malaya exhibition sets. And Scott, in fact, did what I've suggested. They changed the A, B, C, so lowercase prefixes, suffixes to uppercase. So they made them major numbers instead of minor numbers. So I've complained repeatedly about the fact that the introduction to the catalog not only says that minor numbers have lowercase suffixes and major numbers have uppercase suffixes, but they also claim that it has different fonts, that they use a bold regular font for the major numbers and a small italic font for the minor numbers. I spent a lot of time several years ago making what appeared to be major numbers, that is bold regular fonts, into pages. And it turns out that the rule actually is, if it's lowercase, regardless of the font, it's a minor variety. So I had to undo everything I had done for that particular problem. So they should at least change the wording in the introduction so people won't be misled like I was. The very first issues from Morocco, which were issued during the period where the French were moving into Morocco, are listed under Morocco, but they're given A prefixes, that is predecessors. But they weren't really predecessors. They were just stamps that the government of Morocco actually issued, and then they were suppressed when the French took over the place. So they have A prefixes, and they really shouldn't. I don't know what exactly how they're going to handle that, but it's a misuse of that prefix. Bohemian Moravia has a day that they inserted before number one. Same problem. The office is in type is done inconsistently for the United States and Poland. For whatever reason, they called the US and Poland offices in type K instead of having it a separate listing that starts at one at the end of the country. So those should be fixed. The Peru has provisional issues. They're given N prefixes like occupation stamps, but they probably should be handled like the US provisionals and the regular and the Confederate, where they have X numbers. They use X for provisionals. This is a strange one. The US stamps, if you hadn't noticed, are not listed. The types are not listed in alphabetical order. I forget what the exact story is here, but their types are not in alphabetical order. Those of you who collect Italy know that a lot of the sets there include the semi-postal stamps among the regular stamps, so they have the set all together. I believe that those should be separated out and given proper.
Oh, and not just for Italy.
Really, where else?
Every South American country has done that. Every behind the Iron Curtain country, these are obviously later in the classical period.
Yes, yes.
But every country in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain has done stuff like that.
They really are sets. I mean, they were all issued at the same time, same signs and so on. But if you're going to split out the various types, you don't want to include them in a set. So, like Steve just did, if any of you have any comments to make in here that might change the content of this, I sent the draft of this to Tom, and I want to send a corrected version if there are any things to be added or modified. Okay, so that's it for number changes. There are, in fact, dozens more of issues that have to do with numbers, but these I consider to be the most glaring and ones need fixing. Now, here's one of my favorites. This is bad countries. There are a number of countries here that shouldn't be. Turkey, from my point of view, is the worst. Turkey includes both stamps of the Ottoman Empire and stamps of the Republic of Turkey. As we'll see, if we go along in this list here, this causes a lot of other problems. I really think they should have separate entry for the Ottoman Empire. And the catalog numbers, interestingly, would not have to be changed for this particular thing. It would have anomalous behavior. Basically, they would take the stamps of Turkey and Asia, which is really the start of the Turkish Republic, which started at one, and add all the stamps issued by that republic after they were independent. And you would have this gap between the last Turkey and Asia number and the first Turkey Asia, but they could do this without disrupting all of the people who've labeled their Turkish stamps in the current numbers. And then the Ottoman Empire, of course, would just end it. Bouchier is an oddity. If you're aware of this, you'll notice that they have occupation stamp prefixes, and there are no regular issues for Bouchier because, of course, it was never actually a country. What it was a British occupation of a port in southern Iran. So it should have it should be listed under Iran as an occupation stamp. Now, Mesopotamia is the first issues that relate to Turkey. Again, Mesopotamia is in fact the British occupation of the Ottoman Empire. It can't be a British occupation of Iraq, technically, because there had never been an Iraq, and there wasn't Iraq, and they weren't occupying Iraq. They were occupying the Ottoman Empire. This also raises the question that will come up in a moment of when does the occupation end? Does the occupation end when the various European powers were given formal mandates of the territory, and the Ottoman Empire was actually disassembled, or some other point? And I think, again, from a point of view of collectors, most of the people who specialize in Iraq would like to see Mesopotamia listed with Iraq. But I think from a technical point of view, it really has to be listed as an occupation of the Ottoman Empire. The same issues arise with all of the various occupations of the British armies in the Levant, in Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And they should be handled technically as occupations of the Ottoman Empire. And then finally, from the Ottomans, Corfu, the 3 stamps issued by the British government are really, the Italian government should be issued as occupations of the Ottoman Empire.
Are you suggesting that Corfu should be it's like a occupation of the Ottoman Empire? Or?
Yes.
Okay, yes, because Corfu was one of the places that the Ottoman Empire never went to. So I don't understand that. So
Okay, maybe that's an error on my part.
yeah, maybe you mean maybe like Rhodes or something, but Corfu, yeah, it was never part. Yeah, actually, all of the Ionian Islands, I don't think were a part.
Huh. Bechuanaland was one area that I collected when I specialized in South Africa. And it's one of the nastiest because they sort of listing the Bechuana territories as a single country, which they weren't. British Bechuanaland was physically separate from Bechuanaland Protectorate, but they're both listed in Bechuanaland, and you have this strange thing where you skip from one country to another and continue the numbering scheme. So you could keep the numbers, but they should be listed separately. Costa Rica, stamp Wanaka should probably be listed as L stamps.
Yes, because that's exactly what they are.
Yes, I know. And then there's a number of states where basically the country remained the same place, but they changed the name. British Central Africa was changed actually in terms of its official designation to Nyasa Land Protectorate, but they're the exact same place. They just changed the name. And you have this issue with Russia and the Soviet Union. Same deal. They list all of them as Russia stamps.
And again, Phil, this issue applies to maybe later than the classic period, but a lot of countries that change their names, they're not consistent. Half the time, they simply continue on, like Belize.
Yeah.
Continues on from British Honduras. But in Burma, Myanmar is a completely separate place in the catalog. And depending upon the country, they treat it one of these 2 ways. And it's just annoying and inconsistent.
But the problem here, obviously, is these catalogs have been issued for over 100 years, and different people have been in charge of different areas at different times. And I suspect, although the introduction is quite comprehensive, things like this are not discussed in any detail, and there are probably no written policies for them to follow to make everything consistent. So that's probably the problem. And of course, the United States is treated very differently, quite apart from the fact that it's out of alphabetical order. Some of the U.S. Colonies or territories are listed right after the United States, and some others are included in the main listing for the country. Puerto Rico, Philippines. They have a listing in the front of the catalog for the possessions and territories of various European countries, but they do not include the United States in that listing. So they really ought to do that. So these are the worst countries. And as Steve has said, I'm sure that they've made the same sort of mistakes for the later issues as well. All right, country groupings. I believe that South Africa should be arranged like Australia, Canada, Germany, and Italy, in which the predecessor states are listed before the main listing there. Either that, or they should go back to the original way in which all of those things like Queensland and Thurn and Taxis and so on were listed as separate countries, which was what they were. And you have minor issues here with Argentina and Colombia, same sort of deal. These are listed currently at the end of Argentina and Colombia when they might be listed as predecessor states. Because in fact, for example, Colombia, some of these states issued stamps before Colombia issued stamps. They were real. And Yugoslavia, of course, is a mess. Malaya is perhaps the worst.
And this is a perfect example of when Malaya becomes Malaysia, they're separate listings.
Yeah, well, there are about five different listings for Malaya and the predecessor states, starting with the Straits settlements, and ending up with Singapore. And British East Africa is a mess. I discussed this when I had my presentation on companies. And there are a number of different things like that where things are joined and unjoined. The worst of these are the French Central and West Africa, which change frequently. Austria-Hungary, again, these stamps are listed as Austria and Hungary, which in general is correct. But there were, in fact, a bunch of issues before Hungary was allowed to issue its own stamps, which technically made it those were stamps of Austria-Hungary, not just Austria or Hungary.
Many collectors who are interested in a particular country which did not issue stamps in reference to Austria-Hungary, what they do, for instance, suppose you love to collect Irish stamps. Well, there are no Irish stamps until the Free State of Ireland, but people will collect British stamps postmarked in, say, Dublin or Limerick or something like that.
Scott doesn't list those as A stamps, does it? It doesn't list as reissuing.
No, they start with the overprints in Gaelic that mark the first issues of the Irish Republic.
Right. And that alone is maddening.
Yes, it is.
Even for those 8 people in the world who can read Gaelic at this point.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm actually one of them, but anyways.
All sorts of countries went in and out of, quote, Russia, unquote, at various times. And that's a real mess.
Yeah, some of them are listed under Russia and some of them are separate.
Saudi Arabia, the stamp jazz were not local stamps of Saudi Arabia. It was a completely independent country until Saudi Arabia conquered it. So that should definitely be pulled out of Saudi Arabia. And I have 45 other countries, believe it or not, which I'm not listing here, in which there are various problems related to this sort of thing. So really, it's a major issue. It would be interesting if Scott or somebody else would start a discussion thread and publish the main points of that to see what other people think about what should be done with these particular issues. Okay, there are some bad types as well as bad countries.
When you refer to types, you mean the alphanumeric ID before, like L7 or something like that?
That's exactly.
Or N14 or...
Yes, that's what I mean. There are a lot of non-postage stamps in the collection, mostly the US, the revenues and the cut squares, which are not postage stamps. The Mulready sheets from Great Britain, and they have a separate section in Great Britain also for the booklets, which are not listed as part of the stamp sets with the booklet panes normally are. And then there are 2 categories where you have stamps that are not really separate stamps. They are merely stamps that have a different postmark on them. The oldest one of this is the balloon stamps from France, which are just regular stamps of Britain, of France, but canceled in Paris during the siege of Paris. And recently, they've added Hong Kong treaty ports. And these are simply the stamps of Hong Kong, which were postmarked in the treaty ports in China. There's nothing otherwise unique about them. So both of these really don't belong there. The illustrations, I've been told that they're going to restore larger illustrations in the upcoming 2027 issue of the catalog, which is a fine thing. But for a number of types, there are slight differences between the types, and they don't give you enough information or large enough illustrations to allow you to identify these. Austria has several designs in the main listing, which are also used in the offices in the Turkish Empire, and they're slightly different.
Well, the currency is different.
I'm not sure that's true in all the cases.
Yes, it is. Offices in the Turkish Empire generally use soldi as opposed to.
That's something that I'm into if I'm incorrect on that. But the series design of France, A1, is also the same as, looks to be the same as the French colonies design, A4. And it's also very much like French designs, A8, 9, 10, 13, and 14. And they don't do a good job of describing what the differences are. This is one of the things I hate about this. Hopefully they will take this into account. This is something that doesn't involve necessarily changing stuff in the catalog, but just improving the illustrations. And finally, there are a whole load. I started writing an article about this for publication, and I haven't listed even half of all the various objections I had to the catalog. There are literally dozens of these. Dual issuers, Andorra, New Hebrides, and Madagascar. That seems to be handled more or less correctly as far as I can tell. British Columbia and Vancouver Island, both of those places issued stamps under their own name before they had the joint issues. The first stamps in India are skinned. Nigeria is sort of like the countries that came together. There was Oil River Protectorate, there was Northern and Southern Nigeria, and so on. There are listings in China after the main country, which are not in alphabetical order, and you're not quite sure what their status was. Shanghai, Sichuan, Manchuria, so on. They're not listed in alphabetical order. There's a whole range of issues about stamps of civil wars. And some of them are listed as provisionals, others are listed in various ways. And again, it's not consistent, and you're not sure what's going on in some cases. Then there are these things that aren't really stamps issued by a country, but they're issued by a private entity. In the case of Austria, the Danube Navigation Company. In Egypt, the Suez Canal Company. I don't know if there are any others in the class. I don't think there are any others in the classic, but why are there?
Yeah, there's New Zealand had a shipping company that issued its own stamps too.
They're not got listed at the moment, I think. And then the Scott use of sets. This is something they're obviously not going to change. It would do terrible damage to the numbering system. But sometimes they indeed include every stamp that's in a similar design within a set. And the later ones are listed with interpolation suffixes, capital letters. And in other cases, when the same design is issued later on, they issue a whole new set of numbers for that. So again, it's inconsistent. And I'm interested in the postal history of a country. I want to know what stamps were issued when, and I would like to see everything listed in chronological order. In fact, a lot of the pages that I did for my update pages, they were rearranged so that they were in a strict chronological order. That's one of my beefs. But that's it. Any other questions or suggestions? There's something I missed, some pet peeves that you have?
First of all, thank you. I mean, the work you do is wonderful. Airmail stamps, you don't recommend that they be incorporated into the main listing?
I believe that's what Minkus did it, I think. One cataloging company included.
Yeah, and it's a lousy system.
Yeah, well.
I think I will need help on this statement. So anyone who can do so, please speak up. I believe airmail stamps were first separated because airmail was contracted out to private contractors, and therefore the money given to the post office when you bought the stamp was to be divided up, some to the post office and some to the contractor. And I think for that reason, originally, airmail stamps were considered a separate kind of thing. But since say, mid-50s or something, airmail is a meaningless concept, really. You mail a letter, and if it goes to Europe, it goes by airmail. But you don't feel that it should be. Well, of course, you're dealing with the classic catalog.
Yes. Well, Frankly, what I would prefer is to have all stamps listed in a single listing in the date of issue. This is the way you follow what was going on with the postal system.
I think that's what the Miko catalogs do.
Michel has its own catalog.
Well, they have
I mean,
There are a whole series.
scores of catalogs. Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I think they just list issues as they came out, whether they're semi-postal or not, or whether they were airmail or not, or
You better be fluent in German to read it, and not just the German you were taught in school, but stamp German. It's not
Yeah.
the same thing.
yeah.
Because there isn't a word of English in the entire catalog.
I agree with you. You need you need a PhD in philology to get through. There's a similar thing. This is a tangent, and if I'm just gassing away here, tell me to shut up. Like when the catalogs talk about color,
Uh,
uh,
Oh, yeah.
there's absolutely no rhyme or reason for all the different kinds of reddish browns that they've come up with names for, be it lake or be it I don't know, but there's no fixing that.
And
Uh,
of course, it's a gradation anyway, because if you mixed a little bit more of this ink in than that one, you got something closer to lake than to carmine.
and as time goes by, it may decide to change its color.
Yep. And it's because, wasn't that precise. They could
Yeah,
mix the same for what they thought was going to be the same color, and it would come out differently, and frequently did.
there's also the issue of how large an area of a particular color it is. So you can have, say, a dark blue, but if it's an intaglio stamp and the lines are fairly far apart, it looks like a different color than dark blue. It looks
right,
lighter blue.
right,
It's a
right.
terrible,
And you also pointed out that the context in which you view a stamp changes the way you perceive the color of the stamp.
what kind of light are you looking at it in?
And Phil, I had one last question, and that was during your perusal of the various catalogs, have you noticed quotations going back and forth ever from italic to regular type as a stamp? It's determined that, yeah, we know what this thing is worth now. Or have you seen people move the other way, say, well, it's worth $8, but no one's buying it, so it's really a guess.
I can't say that I've seen that happen to any pricing, so I wouldn't know.
Yeah, okay.
It would be very interesting if someone had a complete collection of these catalogs. They could tell you when these various issues cropped in and why. It would be very interesting to know the history of the catalogs, but that's obviously an immense task.
Yeah, I'll say.